Hello, my name is David Stephen Cohen. The following is a talk I gave back in June 2004 as part of the New Jersey History Partnership Project titled Alexander Hamilton, Patronage, and the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures. At 5 a.m., July 11th, 1804, two rowboats departed from separate locations on the Manhattan waterfront, both bound for Weehawken, New Jersey. In one was the sitting Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr. In the other, the former Secretary of Treasury, and perhaps the most visionary of the Founding Fathers, Alexander Hamilton. Both men made their careers in and were residents of New York State, but both had ties to New Jersey. Burr was the son of the second president of the College of New Jersey, later renamed Princeton University, Aaron Burr Sr. Burr's mother was the daughter of the renowned Calvinist preacher Jonathan Edwards, who succeeded his son-in-law as president of the College of New Jersey, but soon after contracted smallpox and died in Princeton. Burr was married to Theodosia Prevost, the widow of a British Army officer whose home at the time of the American Revolution was known as the Hermitage in Hohokus, New Jersey, today. Hamilton was born about 1755 on the island of Nevis in the West Indies. His father was one of the younger sons of a Scottish laird who couldn't inherit the family estate, so left for the Sugar Islands, as the West Indies were known. His mother was of French Huguenot and British descent, who had been previously married to a ne'er-do-well who refused to grant her a divorce. So Hamilton's parents were not married at the time of his birth, which proved to be a political embarrassment for him later in life. The family moved to St. Croix, where Hamilton's father deserted his family. Hamilton's mother died when she was a teenager, leaving him and his brother as orphans. Hamilton needed to find a patron, a pattern that continued throughout his life. Young Alexander Hamilton found work as a clerk for two merchants named David Beekman and Nicholas Kruger, with offices and warehouses on St. Croix, but business connections in New York. And there he gained valuable experience in business. With the financial help of his first cousin, Anne Linton Benton, Hamilton came to New York City either in 1772 or 1773. The key to understanding Hamilton's life and career in America, I think, is the 18th century concept of patronage. Not the patronage in the modern political sense, but more like the modern usage in patron of the arts. This 18th century relationship, for instance, found in the composer Mozart, who had numerous patrons, was defined by historian Gordon Wood as follows. Society was held together by intricate networks of personal loyalties, obligations, and quasi-dependencies. These personal loyalties were not the same as the legal bondage of the unfree. They were not like the explicit subjection of the landless, and they were not even precise reproductions of the many subserviences of patronage-ridden England. Still, these personal relationships were forms of paternalism, dependence and subordination, vague and subtle as they often may have been. Some referred to these relationships as paternalistic, and others called them connections or interests, unquote. Wood argues that the 18th century notion of patronage, which he associates what he calls monarchical society, was overturned by the American Revolution. I'm going to argue here that Hamilton's life and career contradict Wood's thesis. Here I must acknowledge a debt of gratitude to Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, in which he eloquently narrates the social networks in which Hamilton lived, much of which involved connections with New Jersey's political and social economic elite. With the possible exception of Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton was the founding father with the humblest or most common origin: foreign born, modest income, and orphaned, not to mention illegitimate. Wood acknowledges that Franklin didn't rise on the strength of his talents alone. Franklin had his patrons in Pennsylvania who took him on as a protege. As Chernow shows, Hamilton also relied on patrons of one sort or another to aid his upward social mobility. Through introductory letters, Hamilton came to Elizabethtown, New Jersey, to begin his studies at an academy there. Aaron Burr attended the same academy a few years earlier, and the two may have known each other at that time. In Elizabeth, Hamilton found new patrons among the interconnected network of elite families of New Jersey society, which included William Livingston, who was building his country estate at Liberty Hall at the time and later was elected the first governor of the state of New Jersey; William Alexander, also known as Lloyd Stirling, who had an elaborate country estate in Somerset County, modeled after a Scottish landed nobleman, and who was the brother-in-law of William Livingston; and Elias Boudinot, whose home, Boxwood Hall, still stands on East Jersey Avenue in downtown Elizabeth, and who later became president of the Continental Congress. Livingston and Boudinot were on the board of trustees of the College of New Jersey, Princeton University today. Hamilton was interviewed by its new president, John Witherspoon, who had been recruited from Scotland, but Hamilton wanted to be allowed to advance at his own speed, like a previous student named James Madison. The board of the College of New Jersey turned down Hamilton's request, so Hamilton entered King's College in New York City, Columbia University today. His sponsor was another one of his patrons, Lloyd Stirling. Even though King's College was an Anglican institution and was a hotbed of pro-British Toryism, as a student, Hamilton became involved in Whigs politics, supporting the Boston Tea Party and the Stamp Act protests. Again, Hamilton's career took a major turn in New Jersey. As a young captain of the Battery of Horse Artillery in the Continental Army during Washington's retreat across New Jersey in the fall of 1776, Hamilton covered the Army's rear from a bluff overlooking the Raritan River at New Brunswick, now part of the campus of Rutgers University. Coming to the attention of the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, Washington chose Hamilton as an aide-de-camp at Morristown in the winter of 1777-1778. In essence, a glorified secretary because of Hamilton's talent in writing. Washington became the most important patron in Hamilton's life. During Washington's second encampment at Morristown in the winter of 1779-1780, Hamilton met and courted Eliza Schuyler, the daughter of General Philip Schuyler of Albany. They married in December of 1780, thereby establishing Hamilton into a family of the New York Dutch elite. But Hamilton's success was not solely through marriage and contacts. He had a brilliant mind. He was a key delegate at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where he was a proponent of a strong national government. He gave a speech reported in Madison's notes on the convention in which he argued for a president to be elected for life, a speech that was later used by his political enemies as being secretly in favor of an elected monarch. There was a precedent for elected monarchy in places such as Poland. Yet, as one of the major authors of the Federalist Papers, along with James Madison and John Jay, Hamilton made some of the most persuasive and intellectually sound justifications for the Constitution of the United States. In April 1830, 1789, Washington was inaugurated in New York City as the first president of the United States under this Constitution. On the recommendation of Robert Morris of Philadelphia, to whom Washington originally offered the position of Secretary of Treasury, Washington offered the position to his former aide-de-camp during the Revolution. Hamilton chose as his Assistant Secretary of Treasury a man by the name of William Duer. Duer was married to Kitty Alexander, the daughter of Lloyd Stirling, who had been one of Hamilton's patrons as a young man. During the Revolution, Duer, who had grown up in England, had been a supplier for the Continental Army. This appointment proved to be one of Hamilton's biggest mistakes, as we shall see. As Secretary of Treasury, Hamilton made his second greatest contribution to American history after he co-authored the Federalist Papers. The late 18th century witnessed the beginning of a market revolution in England. More than an industrial revolution, the market revolution also involved changes in transportation and banking that in turn brought about changes in cities and in the countryside. Several developments led to the market revolution in England. New machinery, especially in textiles, with the invention of the flying shuttle in 1733, that allowed weaving to be done more rapidly, and of the spinning jenny in 1767 that allowed many threads to be spun simultaneously. Also, new sources of power, including Richard Arkwright's water frame, patented in 1769, that harnessed the water power to spinning and weaving textiles, and the steam-driven power loom first used by Edmund Cartwright in 1787, as well as new means of transportation. In 1777, the Grand Trunk Canal in England, connecting the Mersey and Trent rivers in the Midlands with the ports of Liverpool and Bristol. Perhaps resulting from his youthful experience as a clerk in the West Indies, Hamilton saw the disadvantage of America remaining a predominantly agricultural economy. Hamilton proposed measures to be taken in the United States to ensure a diversified economy. The end was to ensure economic independence to complement Americans' political independence. However, Hamilton also knew that a new institutional structure had to be created to bring about these changes. He proposed three major reports as Secretary of Treasury: the report relative to public credit in January 1790, the report on the National Bank in December 1790, and the report on manufacturers in December 1791. The report on public credit proposed three things: that the foreign debt and interest incurred during the American Revolution should be repaid in full, that state debts incurred during the Revolution should be assumed by the federal government, the so-called assumption of state debt, and that domestic debt should be paid at face value. This report resulted in a major disagreement with his fellow cabinet members, including Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and his former colleague at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, then a congressman representing the state of Virginia. Virginia had paid off most of its revolutionary debt, so it wasn't in favor of assumption. Many of the original holders of bonds, including Revolutionary War soldiers, had sold their securities at less than face value to speculators. Jefferson and Madison didn't think it was fair for these speculators to get face value. Hamilton felt that unless they were paid at face value, the credit of the United States would be compromised. Unfortunately for Hamilton, one of the largest speculators in government securities was his own Assistant Secretary of Treasury, William Duer. This dispute was settled by a compromise. Jefferson and Madison would yield on the assumption issue in exchange for moving the capital of the United States from New York City to a new federal city, as it was called, to be built on the banks of the Potomac River. The capital temporarily was moved to Philadelphia in 1790 while the federal city was being built. To pay off the debt, Hamilton proposed a new tax, an excise tax on distilled liquor, that is, a domestic tax, as opposed to a tariff, that is, a tax on imports. This tax led to the so-called Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, in which frontiersmen in western Pennsylvania refused to pay the tax. President Washington and Secretary of Treasury Hamilton personally accompanied troops sent to put down the rebellion, an act that again hurt Hamilton's reputation. Historian Thomas P. Slaughter noted in his 1987 book, The Whiskey Rebellion, Frontier Epilogue to the American Revolution, that the protesters used the anti-tax rhetoric of the American Revolution to justify their cause. The report on the National Bank proposed a bank modeled on the Bank of England, in which to deposit government funds, to provide a uniform currency, and to help fund industrial projects, among other things. The only problem, again raised by Madison, was that the Constitutional Convention had debated a clause to give the federal government the power to grant corporate charters and rejected it. Thus, it was a power reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution that states the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it by the states, are reserved for the states respectively or to the people. President Washington solicited opinions from his cabinet on the matter, and Hamilton responded with his opinion on the constitutionality of the bank in 1791. He cited the clause in the Constitution that gave Congress the power, quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, and to in order to execute the foregoing powers. In other words, Hamilton argued that there were implied powers that permitted the chartering of a national bank. Oddly, Madison had argued for implied powers in the Federalist Papers. Washington bought Hamilton's arguments, and the Bank of the United States was approved by Congress in January 1791, but with a charter that was limited to 20 years. When the stock for the Bank of the United States went on sale in July 1791, it unleashed a frenzy of speculation. In August, the bubble burst and the market crashed, the first stock market crash in American history. And who do you think was one of the major speculators in bank stock? You guessed it, the self-same William Duer. Notwithstanding this disaster, the Bank of the United States became the forerunner of the Second Bank of the United States when the original charter ran out, and much later in the 20th century, the Federal Reserve System of today. The third major report was the only one not approved by Congress, the report on manufactures. It was the report most closely tied to New Jersey history. Hamilton was assisted in writing this report by Tench Coxe, who had replaced Duer as Assistant Secretary of Treasury. The report on manufactures makes a theoretical case for a diversified economy of both agriculture and manufacturing as a counterweight to the agricultural idea promoted by Thomas Jefferson. In Jefferson's view, the so-called yeoman farmer was the source of American democracy and virtue, and he wanted America to remain an agricultural economy free from the corrupting influences of cities, banks, and businessmen. Both sides appealed to the spirit of the American Revolution. Hamilton wrote in the report for manufacturers, quote, not only the wealth but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufactures. Every nation, with a view towards those great objects, ought to endeavor to possess within itself all of the essentials of national supply. The extreme embarrassment of the United States during the late war from an incapacity of supplying themselves are still a matter of keen recollection. A future war might be expected again, exemplifying the mischiefs and the dangers of a situation to which incapacity is in too great a degree applicable, unless changed by time and vigorous exertion. To this effect, as fast as can be prudent, merits all attention and all the seal of our public council. 'Tis the next great work to be accomplished." Unquote. The report on manufactures was integrally tied to a pet project of Hamilton's, the chartering of a society for establishing useful manufactures, also known as the SEUM or simply SUM. Hamilton is thought to have been the author of both the prospectus for the SUM, dated August 1791, and the charter by the state of New Jersey, dated November 1791, barely 2 weeks prior to the report on manufactures. The SUM charter in generally is viewed as New Jersey's first business corporation, but it was a transitional form of corporation. Corporate charters were not new in American history. Originally, grants from the Crown bestowed exclusive privileges. They included, as well, the right to govern. The Dutch West India Company charter, for example, which established the colony of New Netherland, was one such colonial charter. It granted both government and trade rights, not just to the colonies of North America, but also to the Caribbean, South America, and Africa. It also implied a monopoly on both the fur trade and the slave trade in the early 17th century. In the late 17th and early 18th century, British royal governors granted charters to establish other corporate entities, such as towns and colleges. For example, Queen's College, granted in 1766 to the royal governor by the royal governor William Franklin, the son of Benjamin Franklin. Corporate charters granted exclusive or monopoly rights were one of the characteristics of monarchical society, according to Wood. And he saw that as overturned by the American Revolution. However, the redefinition of the corporation and the debate over whether the new state-granted charters should and did convey monopoly privileges was an issue characterizing the period after the American Revolution and through the middle of the next century. Both sides of the debate invoked the spirit of the Republican spirit of the American Revolution. Thus, there was a precedent for the fact that the charter for the SUM conveyed not only the right to establishing a manufacturing business that was eventually located at the falls of the Passaic River in Paterson, New Jersey today, but also the right to govern a 6 square mile of area that became the citizen of Paterson, named after William Paterson, the governor of New Jersey at the time of the charter. As an incentive, the charter exempted the society from state taxes, the first example of a tax incentive for a business to locate in New Jersey, and exemption from military service for both workers and manufacturers. The charter also authorized the SUM to build canals and improve rivers to better transport more materials and manufactured goods. Finally, the charter authorized the SUM to raise money through a lottery. Yes, there's a long-standing precedent for the New Jersey State Lottery, a common method in colonial America to raise funds in lieu of taxes. The charter was controversial from the start. Even before it was approved, a person in Middlesex County, New Jersey, wrote a letter dated November 1791 to the Philadelphia General Advertiser, using the pseudonym Clytus. Clytus was a Macedonian general who criticized Alexander the Great for succumbing to a lifestyle of wealth and departing from his Spartan origins. In a drunken rage, Alexander killed Clytus. Thus, there was a hidden meaning in the choice of this pseudonym, a thinly veiled personal criticism of Alexander Hamilton. Clitus argued that the proposed SUM charter was too broad. He betrayed his French political bias by citing the fact that after the French Revolution, the National Assembly banned all corporate charters. Note one of the major issues that divided the pro-Hamilton faction from the pro-Jefferson faction, which later became the Federalist and Republican parties under the first party system, was whether to side with our former enemy in England or our former ally in France in the European rivalry that led to the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars. The writer worried that a right of eminent domain was implied in the charter, authorizing the sum to build canals, which would be detrimental to farmers along the rivers on which the canals might be built. He also argued that the use of a lottery to raise money was an example of the state encouraging gambling and would have, quote, a fatal tendency on the morals of the community, unquote. Finally, the writer linked the SUM charter to earlier controversy about funding the federal government at face value. Appealing to American patriotism, the author stated, quote, that the mechanics who suffered great losses in the later war paid heavy taxes and served faithfully in the militia and had been obliged through necessity to sell their hard-earned certificates, and as a result, the brave Continental soldiers will suffer while manufacturers will be exempt from taxes. The nascent first political party system, the Hamiltonian Federalists versus the Jeffersonian Republicans, began to take shape. In a letter dated September 13, 1792, Elisha Boudinot, the brother of Elias Boudinot and one of the directors of the SUM, wrote to Hamilton noting that the petition campaign was beginning against the SUM and that in Philadelphia, quote, a strong party is forming in that city against the Secretary of Treasury, unquote. This is a reference to the beginning of the Jeffersonian Republican Party that would later take a form against the Hamiltonian Federalists. There was a relationship between the concept of patronage and the redefinition of the corporation as exemplified in the SUM. It can be seen in the partial list of shareholders of the SUM, a virtual who's who of the colonial elite in New York and New Jersey, including the above-mentioned Elisha Boudinot, Elias Boudinot of Elizabeth, who had been one of Hamilton's patrons as a student at the Elizabeth Academy, Brockhurst Livingston of New York City, the son of William Livingston, another of Hamilton's patrons, Nicholas Kruger of New York City, the merchant who gave Hamilton his first job on St. Croix, William Paterson of Trenton and Somerville, the governor of New Jersey, Joseph Bloomfield of Burlington, later governor of New Jersey, John Steffens of Hoboken, who was later involved in the steamboat and railroad development, Nicholas Lau of New York City, and several other directors of the Bank of the United States, to which there was a financial tie. Subscriptions to the SUM were invested in stock of the Bank of the United States and used as collateral for loans to finance the construction and operation of the SUM. As well as other stockholders included Richard Stockton, the son of Richard, Richard Stockton, the son of Richard Stockton, the son of the signer of the Declaration of Independence, whose mother, Anise Boudinot Stockton, was the sister of Elias Boudinot, and last but not least, the infamous William Duer, whom the stockholders elected as governor of the SUM. Duer especially was a most unfortunate choice given his speculation in government securities, the Bank of the United States, and in Western land schemes. Duer lost everything in the Panic of 1792, a victim of his own stock speculation in the Bank of the United States, and Duer ended up in debtor's prison. He had taken for his own some of the funds of the SUM, which was a great embarrassment to Hamilton, who remained loyal to Duer throughout it all. Why? I think it had to do with the fact that Duer was the son-in-law of Lloyd Stirling, who was one of Hamilton's early patrons. The board of the SUM decided to replace Duer with Peter Colt of Hartford, Connecticut, the treasurer of the state of Connecticut. At the same time, they contracted with the French architect and engineer Pierre Charles de L'Enfant, who had just prior designed the street layout of the new federal city to be built on the banks of the Potomac. L'Enfant came in conflict with Colt over his elaborate and expensive plans for canals, raceways, and buildings in Paterson. There was also a conflict over authority. L'Enfant didn't want to yield any power to Colt, and finally, the directors suspended L'Enfant and left Colt in charge. The plan of the SUM was to recruit experienced workmen from Europe, especially England, where the market revolution was already underway. Part of the original plan laid out in the Report of Manufactures was both to gain industrial secrets on textile machinery as well as experienced workmen. This is what Hamilton meant in the report by stating one of the advantages of encouraging manufactures was to increase immigration. Another part of the report on manufactures was to employ women and children in factories. Quote, "It is worthy of particular remark that in general women and children are rendered more useful, and the latter more early useful by manufacturing establishments than they would be otherwise," unquote. This may seem hard-hearted to us from a post-industrial perspective, but it should be seen in the context of the craft tradition of the period. Children started out as apprentices. In exchange for their work, they were educated in the mysteries of the craft. Clearly, this was the model the directors of the SUM had in mind. In a letter to Hamilton dated October 1792, Thomas Marshall and William Pierce, who were in charge of the workmen and the machinery at the SUM, wrote, quote, "The training up youth in different branches of manufacturing we consider politic and requisite. In many of the different stages of our respective businesses, a stout boy, by a 12 months instruction, would be able to stand in the shoes of an adult person, and in a country like this where wages are so extremely high, a material saving would be eventually accrued to society if apprentices were taken under certain regulations," unquote. The point is that they were thinking of these child workers as possible apprentices. Peter Colt's daughter, Sarah, was authorized by the SUM to establish a Sunday school for the children of workers. The SUM board meetings in April 1794 shows their motives were not altogether altruistic. Quote, "The superintendent represented to the board a number of children were employed in the factory whose parents were so poor and the wages of the children so low that they cannot go to school, and that if something is not done, a number of children will be withdrawn. Resolved, therefore, that Mr. Colt be authorized to employ a schoolmaster to teach the children of the factory on Sundays, and that the compensation for the master shall not exceed 10 shillings per week," unquote. For a variety of reasons, the SUM's efforts in the 1790s never got off the ground. In 1796, Colt resigned his position as superintendent, and the stockholders' meeting was called to dissolve the corporation. But they decided not to dissolve the SUM, but it was dormant until the year prior to the War of 1812. Two sons of Peter Colt, Roswell L. Colt and John Colt, came back to Paterson to revive the industrial effort. They were the uncles of the more famous Samuel Colt, who was born in Connecticut but came to Paterson to start the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company in 1836. A new raceway was laid out in 1807 and a third in 1827. Ironically, the SUM ended up being involved in a lawsuit against the Morris Canal and Banking Company in 1830 over the canals company diverting of water from the Passaic River, which affected the falls of the Passaic River. The SUM was represented by a lawyer named Samuel Southard. It wasn't until the period of 1830 to 1850 that Hamilton's vision for an industrial city at the falls of the Passaic River was realized. But it was not in cotton textiles, but in textile machinery, according to historian Herbert Gutman. The growth of ironworks, machine tools, and locomotives, including the Rogers Locomotive Works, the development of firearms, the original Colt including the original Colt revolver, and in the 1840s, the beginning of silk mills that would give Paterson the reputation in the late 19th century as Silk City. In conclusion, contrary to Gordon Wood's thesis, neither patronage nor corporate charters disappeared from American life after the American Revolution. As the founding father who with Benjamin Franklin rose from common circumstances to become part of the political and social elite in America, Hamilton relied on patronage to achieve and maintain his success. Patronage also explains his loyalty to William Duer, despite the latter's misdeeds that damaged Hamilton's reputation. In fact, one could even say that patronage continues to the present day if one takes into account protege-mentor relationships in modern business and the so-called legacy admission at elite universities. Both patronage and monopolies granted to corporations, both contexts which historian Gordon Wood associates with monarchical society, help explain the life and career of Alexander Hamilton. To characterize patronism and monopoly as monarchical, as Wood does an injustice to Hamilton. It adopts the ideology of the Jeffersonian Republicans as the American ideology. I have argued here that Hamilton's vision of an economic independence based on a diversified economy of both agriculture and industry was also consistent with his view of the political independence of the American Revolution. I'd like to end with one last example of what Wood calls the monarchical society, namely the distinction between gentlemen and commoners. This was very much behind the tradition of dueling, as Wood notes. A gentleman whose honor was challenged by a commoner would respond by caning, that is, striking him with a cane, as what happened to abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner in May 1856 on the floor of the United States Senate by the U.S. Senate by House of Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina. It is the ultimate insult because it was a punishment fit only for slaves or a dog. A gentleman, even in the 19th century, would challenge his opponent to a duel. Even Andrew Jackson, the symbol of democracy in the first half of the 19th century, engaged in dueling. The military tradition of being an officer and a gentleman continues to the present day. It was not uncommon for young Army officers to engage in duelings over affairs of honor. In fact, Hamilton served as a second in a duel in December 1708 between another Continental Army officer named John Lawrence and General Charles Lee against an alleged slurs that Lee had made about General George Washington. And thus we come back to Hamilton and Burr's confrontation on the dueling grounds in Weehawken. At 7 a.m., they paced off the traditional 10 steps, turned, and fired almost simultaneously. Hamilton fell to the ground. He died 31 hours later in his home in New York City. He was only 49 years of age. Thus ended the life of one of America's most brilliant and visionary founding fathers. Hamilton never personally profited from his financial endeavors. A subscription had to be taken up for his widow, Eliza, nor did he live to see his lifetime the realization of the vision he proposed for an urban industrial America.